Welcome all of you here to the postcard seminar series that we have for the Wichita Postcard Club. We've been doing it a long time. If you look inside the show program, we have listed each one of the show themes through the years, and that's fun to look at. By the way, the show program was emailed to all of you who had email and who are members. So maybe you looked at it before you came to the show, but it's there when you get home as well. But we're real pleased to have you here this morning for this seminar. And I want to introduce our speaker, Tom Basore. I know him from North Newton, or north of Newton, Kansas, which is just north of Wichita. And there's some empty seats up here, Paul. Okay. And so please give a round of applause for Tom Basore. Hello, everybody. For your information, FYI, we are trying to record this program ahead of time just so we make sure that we have something that's works and is good contrast and everything for the YouTube. So please bear with us, and here we go.
So Dueling Hardware Companies is a story that I've told many times over the years, and it involves two hardware companies, Simmons Hardware Company and Shapley Hardware Company. Both of these companies are or were based in St. Louis, and there's a very distinct reason for that. Simmons Hardware Company had what we call a house brand, and their house brand was King Cutter, and Shapley Hardware Company's house brand was Diamond Edge. And we'll get into why that is, how that happened, and that's the idea of this presentation for me, in addition to showing postcards, of course. Shapley Hardware Company was started by Augustus F. Shapley. He went by A.F. Shapley for his entire career, and that's the way I'll refer to him throughout this. Simmons Hardware Company was started by Edward Campbell Simmons. E.C. Simmons is what he went by his whole life, so I will refer to him as E.C. throughout. These two men were responsible for much of the development of the West, west of the Mississippi River. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide, but A.F. Shapley he lived 1810 to 1902, so he was a predecessor of E.C. Simmons in some ways, but they also worked within 4 blocks of each other and were fierce competitors for a number of years. So it's interesting that these two companies turn out the way that they do. This is a fun story, so I hope you enjoy it. The development of house brands, again, I said that we call them that, and there's a reason why, as opposed to a regular brand. Branding has been around for a really long time, even back into the 16th, 17th century. And even before that, actually, it goes way back where loaves of bread were branded to ensure the ingredients and ensure that it was baked by someone who was allowed to bake. So it goes way back to the Middle Ages even. But branding had always been done by the people who made the product, actually manufactured it, until the mid 1800s, and that was with these two companies. They developed something that they called a house brand, and up until about 1866, both Simmons Hardware Company and Shapley Hardware Company were purchasing all of their goods from the manufacturers with the manufacturer's branding on it. So if they bought axes, they might buy Lippincott axes. And when they put them in their catalog and when they merchandised them and market them to the hardware stores that they supplied as a wholesaler, they would market them and merchandise them as Lippincott axes and not as their own brand. What happened was there's a couple of different stories, but the story that I believe is best documented is the story of the King Cutter brand. The story goes that E.C. Simmons was buying Lippincott axes. In fact, when we talk about the taming of the West, axes were a key component in that, the clearing of the land, the harvesting of lumber, and a lot of other things that were necessary for settlers to have axes. So Simmons Hardware Company was buying axes in by the train carload. And at some point, Simmons became aware that Lippincott Axe Company was selling their axes to his competitors at much lower volumes for the same price. This was something that he sought a grievance with Lippincott and stated that he thought he should get better pricing because he was buying more product and more consistently. Lippincott refused to give him better pricing, and this upset Simmons. Simmons stewed in that for a while and came up with this idea that all of this time he had been merchandising and marketing someone else's brand, and now he's having a falling out with that brand. And in doing that, he has lost all the merchandising and marketing that he had put into Lippincott axes. So why not have my own brand and then have someone else manufacture my brand for me? And in that process, I can merchandise and market my own brand. If I have a falling out with a manufacturer, the next manufacturer will also put my brand on it. So I haven't lost all of that effort. So these are the this is kind of the timeline that takes us up until the time of postcards. So I wanted to get through that. This is actually the mid to late 19th century, is the period that we all know was really the taming of the West. It was a settlement of the plains. It was moving westward for various reasons. So Shapley, because of his age and everything, he was working for Rogers and Company in Philadelphia, and he became a junior partner with Rogers and Company in Philadelphia. And part of his agreement was that he would come to St. Louis, to the gateway to the West, and try to capture business of this booming economy for Rogers and Company in Philadelphia. So in doing that, he came to St. Louis and set up shop under the name Rogers, Shapley and Company in St. Louis. And then Rogers was um, filling orders for that location as well and having them shipped. And the shipping route had really just recently opened up, where volumes of merchandise could be brought around the Florida Peninsula to from the East Coast to New Orleans, and then loaded onto barges and barged up the Mississippi River to St. Louis. That was a relatively new route at this time, and this allowed for Shapley to develop a full warehouse of goods necessary to tame the West right in St. Louis, the gateway to the West. And that was the plan. That worked out pretty well. Between 1843 and 1847, however, Rogers passed away in Philadelphia, and he was replaced by a guy by the name of Day, and it became Shapley Day and Company. This is only the St. Louis branch. The Philadelphia or the Pennsylvania branch remained Rogers Day and Company, but Shapley Day and Company was the St. Louis brand. Shortly after that was rumors of gold in California. So in 1840, the population of St. Louis was 16,500. We all know that the gold rush was 1849, and in 1850, the St. Louis population was 80,000 people. So the requirement of goods, of durable goods that hardware companies supplied, from tools and guns and knives and all of the nails and hardware, door hardware, all of the stuff that was necessary to develop residences for these 80,000 people who had poured into St. Louis, plus all of the people who had poured past St. Louis onto the plains, working their way westward and chasing their dream of gold in California. So all of those goods made this company very wealthy between 1843, when they set up, and 1850, when the St. Louis population had exploded so much. The population of St. Louis continued to explode throughout the 19th century, and after 1850, and it became really a hub for the West as we know it. I have Asterisk by Diamond Edge House brand in 1864. The reason I have that is I have found no verification that 1864 was the date of the Diamond Edge House brand. All of the verification I have on that comes from the 20th century after Simmons Hardware Company was out of business. I have a hunch that maybe it was Shapley developed the Diamond Edge brand in an answer to the Simmons house brand that was developed in 1866. So I have a bit of I'm not sure about that. Shapley Cantwell came about after Day retired. Shapley took another partner. His name was Cantwell. It became Shapley Cantwell in 1880, 1886. Cantwell stepped out. It became Shapley Hardware Company. And then 1901, it became Norvell Shapley Hardware Company, and we'll talk about that in the next screen. Simmons Hardware Company, similarly, E.C. Simmons came to St. Louis with his family in 1846, and his dad was chasing the dream as well of moving west. 1851, Wilson Brothers Hardware hired Simmons to work around the warehouse a little bit. He moved to 4 years later to Child Pratt and Company, which is also a hardware company, and worked there as a stock clerk for a while. Didn't see opportunity there and ended up moving in 1859, 4 years later, to Wilson Levering and Waters, which was an aging hardware concern in St. Louis. And I think he saw that all of the partners were aging. So by 1863, Wilson had left, and it became Levering Waters and Company by 1864. And this was partially influenced by the Civil War. Waters was the only one of the original partners left, and he took E.C. Simmons as a full partner, and it became Waters Simmons and Company. 1866 is when the King Cutter House brand was first developed, and that's based on the story of the Lippincott Axe Company that we talked about. 1870, Waters got out, and it became E.C. Simmons and Company. In 1881, a young man came to work for Simmons Hardware Company. His name was Sanders Norvell. He was an ingenious young man. He came to work at 14 years old to help his family's finances. He started out kind of at an entry level job, and he worked his way up to salesman. He wrote an amazing book called 40 Years of Hardware, where he describes his selling hardware on the Kansas plains between 1881 and 1900. He would take trains out here to western Kansas and sell hardware. And there's a very interesting book called 40 Years of Hardware. There's some reprints that you can find on eBay if you're interested. He worked his way up to vice president at Simmons Hardware Company by 1900. 1900, E.C. Simmons was old and retired. He had three sons who had all graduated from college. They graduated from Yale. They were smart boys, and they had learned some new ideas about business while they went to Yale University. So Simmons had the option of turning Simmons Hardware Company over to the old guard, which was Sanders Norvell and some other older employees who had been there for a long time, or letting his sons take the business over. He opted for the latter in his retirement in 1900. This did not go over well with Norvell Sanders and some of the other older guard people who were at Simmons Hardware Company. Three of them, actually four of them, pooled their money, with Sanders Norvell pooling the highest percentage, and they purchased Shapley Hardware Company in 1901, making the Norvell Shapley Hardware Company. So 1901, Norvell, William Yantis, and Henry Gordon pooled their money together and bought controlling interest in Shapley Hardware. It left two of A.F. Shapley's sons, one as a vice president, the other as a treasurer. in the organization. And so it became Norvell Shapley Hardware Company. Um, Norvell is a very um, prolific writer, and he was a well-known person in society at this period of time, all over the United States, in fact, all over the world. He's a well-known person at this time in history, right around 1900. Um, on the left there is a postcard that I have of on the left-hand side is Wallace Simmons, and that's E.C. Simmons' oldest son. He became president of Simmons Hardware Company. Next to him, sitting down with a dog in his lap, is Edward Simmons. That's E.C. Simmons' second son. He became a vice president at Simmons Hardware Company. Next to him, also sitting down to the right there, is George Simmons, and George Simmons was the youngest son of E.C. Simmons, and he became the sales manager for Simmons Hardware Company. Standing up is George Meyer, and George Meyer was a trusted employee of E.C. Simmons who stayed on after Simmons' retirement, and he kind of held a role of general manager for Simmons Hardware Company. So this is a very rare card, and it shows the boys and Henry Meyer. I said George Meyer. His name is Henry Meyer. Yeah, it's an interesting um, card that I've was pretty happy to find. So branding, so early on in the 19th century, the brands were developed. There's no question that Simmons Hardware developed King Cutter in 1866. There's no question that sometime in the 1860s, Shapley Hardware Company developed the Diamond Edge brand. But you really didn't see much of either of the brands until 1900 and 1901, 1902, when Sanders Norvell took over Shapley Hardware Company. He started capitalizing on that brand and started putting it on things, putting it front and center, and really started marketing that brand. And so these are some a series of postcards that were put out shortly after Shapley took over. I think these were mid 19 teens, or no, 1910s. You can see how he put that logo front and center. So again, they're merchandising, they're marketing, they're these things with their own brands. They didn't manufacture any tools of their own. They only purchased tools from known makers of planes or pocket knives or knives of any kind or axes, whatever tools or cutlery they were going to brand. They bought it from a well-known manufacturer of that brand and and paid them to put their name on it. So they would retool enough to put their logos on it instead of the manufacturer logo. That's a very new concept at this time in history. Really was it's something that still happens to this day. So it was the beginning of that process. We see it with Walmart. We see it with a lot of other current grocery stores and other companies where they buy things from manufacturers and put their own branding on it. So again, more photos of the interior of Shapley Hardware Company. This is a big business. They are doing in volume. They're doing probably maybe as much as 25% of all of the hardware volume in the United States at the time out of this facility. Interestingly, Simmons Hardware Company was doing more than them at that time, but we'll get to that. One of the things that Sanders Norvell did that I think is interesting is he came up with these ad campaigns. This one being um, Tools and the Man, and Tools and the Man described and showed what tools other countries were using and the contrast between the quality of tools that Diamond Edge made. And this was a way of marketing that's really similar to what International Harvester did. A lot of you may have seen the International Harvester series of farming around the world, and they had those two different series of cards where they were showing farming in other countries. These are similar. And the one at the left there is East Africa. Next to that is Japan. Next to that is Norway. And the one on the far right is India, showing them using a safety razor in India. or how they're shaving, I guess, in India, whatever. But this is a fun series. There are several of the cards. I think I have 10 of these cards. So I'm not sure if this was a 12 card series or if it was a 10 card series, but something to watch for. They're cool cards. Not all of mine are in great shape. I'd probably upgrade if I have an opportunity at some point. King Cutter, so we saw that around 1901, 1902, Sanders Norvell started really capitalizing on the Diamond Edge brand. In 1904, St. Louis hosted the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, the World's Fair, and in that, then a lot of manufacturers came to St. Louis with cutting edge ideas, and I think there was a lot of ideas shared there. I think the Simmons boys took advantage of that, and I saw several business practices change shortly after 1904 and the hosting of this World's Fair. One of the things that they changed was their logo, and the previous logo, there were a few different versions of it, but they were all basically on a shield that said E.C. Simmons King Cutter. The shield was not something that they could trademark, and trademarking was something that was sort of new at the time, but they saw the value in being able to have a registered trademark that nobody else could use. So they developed the logo that people most recognize for King Cutter now. This represents a piece of wood with a sawtooth through it. Some people call it a log and wedge, but the stories, the recollections that I've found pretty much are unanimous in this being a representation of a sawtooth through a piece of wood. So that is what the King Cutter logo came to be seen as. It was unique in that in shape, and they were able to make that a registered trademark. About this time, Wallace Simmons, the president, contacted Ayers Company, which was one of the biggest advertising firms in the world at the time. They were all over the world, and they were cutting edge on finding ways to market and merchandise new brands. And they commissioned Ayers, even though Ayers was not the cheapest option for advertising companies, to help them boost the name recognition of King Cutter and the logo recognition of King Cutter among the population. And so they wanted to come up with ad campaigns that would ultimately end up in the Saturday Evening Post and on billboards and just anywhere they could possibly get this logo in front of people to build name recognition and trust. And in that, they were trying to produce the best quality goods that they could and put this brand on it. There were cheaper goods that they would offer without this brand, but if it had this brand, they wanted it to represent high quality. And in that was their motto, the recollection of quality remains long after the price is forgotten. And that was something that E.C. Simmons had coined and began using back in the 19th century. And it's something that they stuck with pretty much the whole history of King Cutter. So one of the plans for this new idea that the brothers had was they started seeing their business sloughing off in areas because smaller regional warehouses were popping up. In Kansas, we had Lee Hardware Company in Salina would be a good example. Townley, up by Kansas City, Stowe Hardware and Hutchinson, Colliday Hardware popped up, and all of these companies were offering faster delivery of goods to the hardware stores they served. The Simmons brothers decided that they were going to develop a plan for regional hardware warehouses so that they could get to their dealers faster. And in that, they ended up with warehouses, of course, in St. Louis, but one in Minneapolis, Sioux City, Wichita, Toledo, New York, and there was also one that came in Philadelphia. And so they developed these warehouses they went into these cities and they built state-of-the-art buildings, and they were big buildings capable of holding the volume necessary to support the hardware stores all around these major metropolitan areas. It also allowed them quicker access to manufacturers who they were buying goods from, because whoever was closest to the manufacturer would take delivery of the goods, and then they would trade it back and forth with the other warehouses. They would distribute it out of the warehouse in Minneapolis or Sioux City or wherever, to the other warehouses, rather than bringing everything into St. Louis for redistribution. So that saved them some money too. So that was the beginning of the regional hardware warehouses. So in that, then, some of the people who stayed with Simmons Hardware through thick and thin were rewarded by having their name put on a warehouse. And this happened in Wichita, the Morton Simmons Hardware Company. That was named after I.W. Morton, who was an important person in Simmons Hardware Company history prior to 1900. He was no longer active at 1900, so this was just kind of a tip of the hat to I.W. Morton for all he had done to Simmons Hardware Company by naming the Wichita branch after him. Diamond Simmons Hardware Company is Sioux City. Standard Simmons was Toledo. None of these names necessarily had anything to do with the warehouse. It was a tip of the hat to for job well done and for their loyalty to Simmons Hardware Company. So these cards all represent those different warehouses that I just mentioned. So Simmons Hardware Company didn't produce a lot of printed advertising postcards. Shapley Hardware Company did produce quite a few, and we'll look at some of those. These cards that most people here have seen a version of are really the only printed cards that Simmons Hardware offered their dealers. And on the back of each of these cards, there was a place for dealer copy. So they could either ask Simmons to go to print the cards with their name and the store name and any information they wanted to add, or that when they got the card, there was a spot for them to do that, to stamp it or whatever. With their name and information. Simmons offered these for no charge to their dealers through their catalog system. The On the left bottom here, the left top this is called the Lawnmower Girl, and people recognize this. And there are a few variations of that. There's one without the King Cutter logo on it, with just the copy in the lower corner there, and the same picture. I believe there's a white border version of this that's not an oversized card. These are 4x6 cards, so it's a smaller card. The lower left, however, this is the only card of this version that I've ever seen. I've looked over the years. I bought this one maybe 20 years ago or more. Was pretty excited to get it. I looked it over really carefully. It's obviously an original card, and it's just the only one where the ladies have blonde hair, and there's a boy in the picture. All of them merchandising their lawnmowers. On the right-hand side there, the dog don't mind. This was an ad campaign that was very well received. People thought it was funny. People still, it's touching to people. It usually moves people in some way when they see it. When I was I was the historic advisor for the hotel in Old Town in Wichita. The hotel in Old Town is the Morton Simmons hardware warehouse that was converted to a hotel. And they started that in 1997 and ended it in 1999, the renovation, and now it is the hotel in Old Town. So during that process, I sat through the meetings for decorations, and I helped them buy and curate the museum that's now at the hotel in Old Town. Some of you may have been with us for our tour on Thursday. This was blown up into a poster format. It was reproduced, and they're pretty well done reproduction. So during that process, I offered one of these to the hotel in Old Town. There was 3 meetings about whether or not this was appropriate to put in the hotel, and ultimately it was decided it would be put in the hotel. So it was put in the lobby of the hotel at Old Town. A poster of this card was put there. Later, it was taken down, but there's the controversy being obviously some people don't know if it's culturally sensitive. At the time when this was produced, there was a lot of derogatory references to ethnic people, to Native Americans, and to African Americans in our country. So it wouldn't have been unusual for this to be very derogatory. In my opinion, it's not derogatory at all. I think it's just a snapshot out of the past. In fact, there's a real photo of this that was used for advertising purposes by Simmons Hardware Company. I have a copy of that real photo of real people, and it looks just like this. Only this is just like a colored version of the same thing. So anyway, that's the two printed cards offered by Simmons Hardware Company. Both companies used the salesman is coming postal cards, and they used a variety of different ways to really make them eye-catching for the dealers. So the dealers knew that they were coming on a certain day, and they knew to be there because they only got to see that dealer maybe once a quarter, maybe once every 6 months or so. And when he came, they wanted to be able to see him, and they usually had issues. They wanted to return something. They had something going on that they needed to talk to that salesman about. So the company would send out these postal cards with the date that the salesman was due to visit the store. These are some from Shapley and Norvell Shapley Hardware Company. Here's some from Simmons Hardware Company. They spent time trying to promote items that were seasonal. A lot of times, the hardware business is very seasonal. Bicycles obviously aren't selling well in November in most areas, but they sell really well in May. So they try to make their advertising, not only their national advertising, but also the advertising to their dealers at an appropriate time so that a dealer in Kansas could order his bicycles, and they maybe would send this to him in February so that he was thinking about bicycles in February rather than thinking about them in May when he could sell them. Some of the things that both of these companies did was offered point of sale and items to promote the brand wherever they were. This is a series of cards, or a group of cards that were from the Anvil Chorus, and that was at the Civic and Industrial Parade in Wichita, at the Wichita Jubilee. And I think that was, Hal might know better than me, but I think that was 1908. It was 1908. And this float, all of the point of sale, the signs, and even the blankets on the horses, there was a lot of logos on there, and it was a very upbeat and exciting parade float to see. On the back, you'll see some men standing there, and they are playing anvils. So that's what the anvil chorus part is about. Is they have hammers and they're striking the anvils, different size anvils, to make different tones on the back of this. So it was quite a spectacle to see at the parade, and just a really um, a way to get that logo out in front of a lot of people all at once. And this parade float was put out by Morton Simmons Hardware Company. So it was actually the wholesale house that sponsored this float in downtown Wichita in 1908. You'll notice the lady on the corner on the left-hand side there, both of those cards. You'll see the lady sitting on the corner of the float, and she has King Cutter logos on her. I've seen other versions of women with dresses on with King Cutter logos. This is my card. It's in kind of poor shape, but it still exists, and it's a wonderful view of a lady with her King Cutter gear on. King Cutter items appealed to women too, in that they did kitchen shears and kitchen knives and dressmaking shears. They sold a lot of scissors. They sold a lot of meat grinders that clamped on the table and things like that for ladies. And so they wanted to merchandise to ladies as well. And that is part of what this whole dress and garb was about. And having ladies involved in their products was important to them. There were ads in Ladies Home Journal and other places for King Cutter goods for the name recognition among the females in the country too. So this is the Wichita warehouse. This is Morton Simmons Hardware Company in Wichita. This was the warehouse that the Simmons boys built, had built. It was state of the art. It's a very stout building. At the top, you'll see what people call a clock tower. It's not a clock tower. There was never a clock in there. What that was is a water tower. It was this warehouse was engineered. Hardware companies were susceptible to fire. They carried ammunition and tires and paint and a lot of other things that could be very flammable. So they built the building with doors held open by tungsten strips so that if that tungsten got hot enough, it would melt and the door would slam shut. When the door slammed shut, it would isolate an area of the warehouse and cut the air supply off, hopefully. And also, it would direct the water from the water tower on top to that area of the building to try to extinguish the fire. So it was very state of the art. All of the Simmons hardware warehouses after the same in the regional warehouses that they built were engineered similarly with this fire suppression system. It was some of the first fire suppression systems in the country. And it's very state of the art at the time. This is not a postcard, but it's a photo that I own that I thought was very interesting. First of all, the building appears to be very new, so I believe that this is maybe one of the first actual photos of the building after it was opened and started actually doing business. Where the train sits is now Rock Island Street, and that's where the main entry into the hotel at Old Town is. And the street in front is First Street here in Wichita. So that's where this hotel sits now. What happened was I was taking pictures of this building in the early 1990s. I thought that it was probably going to be torn down because it was in bad repair. Jack DeBoer and a group of financiers got together and decided to make it a marquee hotel in downtown Wichita. They did that. Jack DeBoer is best known for he started Candlewood Suites. He's a Wichita businessman and he cared about the history of this building and about the area, and I really appreciate that very much. He asked me if I would be his historical advisor on this project, and I agreed to do that. And so that project completed in 1999. It's open now. It has a great museum inside. It's a fun place to visit. It's a fun place to spend the night. Part of this what interested me too was this is a blow up on the left hand side there of the front street there at First Street. And there's two things here. First of all, the cart, that's a motorcycle delivery wagon. I believe it's the same wagon that we used to promote the show card this time. And this postcard is a cut down postcard, regretfully, but it is still just one of my favorites. It's an Indian motorcycle delivery wagon for King Cutter Goods, and it is unidentified on the postcard, but I feel that this cart that's in this picture of the Wichita warehouse, that there's a very good chance it's the same cart. The logos on the side look very similar, and the rear fender there with the name Indian Motorcycle on it looks like it's the same or very similar to the cart in my picture. So that excited me. The other piece of this was that during the renovation of the hotel at the very end, very last thing before the hotel was to open, we had a meeting and Jack asked me if there was anything else that could be done to this hotel to make it historically accurate. The hotel had sold, or the warehouse had sold to another hardware company after Simmons sold it or sold out. And we'll get to that. But the company was Harwai Hardware Company, and Harwai had not only did they paint over the King Cutter logo on the water tower. They painted their logo. They also tore out the header over this door and put Harwai over the door. So I mentioned that that's supposed to have King Cutter. I showed him this picture. 3 days later, I drove by the hotel and he had stonemasons out there tearing that Harwai header out and putting in the King Cutter header back over the door. So now, as you drive by on First Street, you'll notice that the King Cutter header is over the door, and that made me very happy. It's really a fun place. I encourage everybody to go take a look. Here's some of the Diamond Edge parade floats. So part of the supplying of point of sale to the local dealers and the hardware stores around that they sold to was also giving them signage and things to really get that brand out in front of the local community where their store was. And parades were a big deal at that time. So here's a few of the parade floats with Diamond Edge advertising on them. One of my favorite areas of postcards, real photo postcards, are the parade floats. Here's some King Cutter floats. Same thing. They tried to be very prolific with the logo, really wanted to get it out there, and they would send them design ideas and photos and things that they could model their float after. But you'll notice that even the horses are decorated with King Cutter logos. In the upper left-hand corner with the big King Cutter logo on the horse is fun. The lower left-hand side, that's from Oklahoma, and even stores that weren't wealthy would try to participate in this, and that's you can tell that he didn't have a huge stock of goods in his hardware store in Oklahoma, but he still put together a parade float for their local parade. And the lower right hand corner, of course, that's a Model T that's all dressed up with King Cutter gear on it. On the back of that is a pocket knife, a giant pocket knife, King Cutter. That pocket knife, we believe, is part of a St. Louis World's Fair display, or either the St. Louis or the San Francisco World's Fair display. And it was electrically, the blades would open and close. Whether or not that one was actually hooked up to electricity, I don't know, but there is an example of one of these that's in a private collection. We know that they exist, and it's pretty fun. So one of the people who worked for E.C. Simmons was J.A. Carroll, and Jim Carroll. He was in charge of the catalog house or the catalog department and advertising and merchandising. A lot of the point of sale, a lot of the signs and the different things were made in the print shop at Simmons Hardware Company. Jim Carroll actually designed and made this huge display at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. If you look at this, the entire thing is made up of hardware. You can see the saws over the archway. Those are all hand saws, actual hand saws. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of this. Under the archway is a scene, and it has like a waterfall, and the waterfall was a chain, and the chain was moving. We see on the left-hand side there, we see the men that are standing there, and they're mechanized men that are playing anvils. So they're standing there beating on anvils. On the right-hand side, on either side of the archway, there's a pair of shears on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, there's the giant pocket knife that I was talking about. And so once this display was taken down, the pocket knife and the shears they would share those with dealers. So they'd send them out to the dealer to use for a while, and then they would send them back. This was all a working display. So there's a clock there. That was working. The shovel is the minute hand on the clock, and all of that was working, and it was all hardware products. So it was very ingenious. So some of you have seen this postcard from 1915. A little more rare one is the one from 1904, St. Louis World's Fair. And so this was the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Similarly, this big windmill turned. The picture had movement in it, and the fountains had movement, and you'll also see the scissors and the pocket knife on this display. One of the things that you'll notice on the back of this card or on the front, whichever way you look at that, is that they were still using the Shield logo at 1904 at the World's Fair. They would have had the most current logo that they were using at that World's Fair, and so we know that they didn't change until 1905. And that's also when the Ayers Company really put their advertising campaign forward. So there was this is a float of Norvell Shapley Hardware Company. Interestingly, you'll see on the right or left-hand side of the float, there's something that says "Read the Gimlet." The Gimlet was a little book that was put out by Shapley Hardware Company. It had advertising, had little funny stories in it. It had stories of interest to hardware dealers. And it was made as kind of just a note to the dealers who use Shapley Hardware Company, and but they started having people request to subscribe to it that were outside of the hardware business. So they started publishing it and offering subscriptions to it for 24 cents per year, and they would send you the gimlet. And so they ended up with, I think, somewhere around 100,000 subscribers. One of the stories that came from this was that Mike Kinney was the editor of this book. And it was Mike Kinney, Teamster and editor, was how he signed his name in this periodical. And he always wrote pieces for it and would sign it Mike Kinney. People who worked for Shapley Hardware Company didn't know who Mike Kinney was. They would, in fact, it was kind of a thing that they would argue about, well, who's Mike Kinney? We don't even know who Mike Kinney is. And the truth was that Mike Kinney was Sanders Norvell. Sanders Norvell used Mike Kinney as a pen name. He didn't think it would go over well for the president of the company to be writing this booklet, so he made it someone who was a little more relatable to not only the people in the stores, but also the employees of Shapley Hardware Company. Even a lot of his trusted employees didn't know that Mike Kinney was actually Sanders Norvell. So in 1911, Sanders Norvell was invited to go to the coronation of the King and Queen of England. The coronation was a big deal at that time, of course, and it was quite the society event. Sanders Norvell was probably one of the most wealthy people in the country. He was really doing a lot of business in hardware, and that was a big business right then. He put a notice in the gimlet that stated that anyone who would send a postcard to him at his hotel in London, that he would return a full color postcard from the coronation to them. Is all they had to do is send a postcard in care of Mike Kinney at the hotel that Sanders Norvell was staying at in London, and they would return a postcard in full color about the coronation back to that person. So that happened. Sanders Norvell went to the coronation. He checked into his hotel in London. A couple of days later, it occurred to him that he needed to go check and find out if anybody had responded to his request for them to send a postcard. When he checked in with the clerk at the hotel, the clerk was beside himself, wanted to know where this Mike Kinney was. He hadn't checked in, he didn't know who he was, and they had to hire somebody to go through the mail to pick out the hotel's mail and make sure that they didn't miss anything because of the volume of postcards that were coming in for Mike Kinney. They had bags and bags of postcards for Mike Kinney, and they were overflowing his storeroom, and the clerk was pretty upset about it. Sanders Norvell knew that there was no way that he could possibly answer all of the cards, so he went to Tuck, which is a big postcard publisher. Most of you know that in London. And he writes about it, says that they were the biggest postcard publisher in the world at the time, and it had them print a coronation card the back of a coronation card with Diamond Edge as a quality pledge and a little handwritten note from him, and then to actually send those out to everyone who had responded. So they did that, and I heard about it, and I read about it, and I started looking for them, and I found these two versions of the Mike Kinney postcard, coronation postcard. I'd be interested in other versions if there are any, but it's a fun one to look for. If you have some coronation cards, flip through them. There's a chance that you have one of these Diamond Edge Mike Kinney cards. So Shapley Hardware Company and Norvell Shapley Hardware Company made a lot of printed cards, different printed cards. These being all holiday cards. I've got some other ones I'll show you as we go down the line. But they were really trying to get their logo out there. They sent these to stores. They sent it to anybody who was on their mailing list. So they'd send out a lot of them. And the idea there was spaced repetition to get people aware of the Diamond Edge brand. So it was a branding thing. Simmons also did things to promote their brand. They didn't use a lot of postcards, but this is an interesting one that this is my puzzle down in the lower left-hand corner. They made this puzzle and they sent it out to hardware stores all over the country, and they sent with them posters and point of sale, and they encouraged them to have contests for the kids to put the puzzle together, and whoever puts the puzzle together the fastest of the boys gets a keen cutter pocket knife, and whoever put the puzzle together fastest of the girls got a pair of dress shears. And so they had kids, you'll see in the picture here on this postcard, of the kids standing in line to put the puzzle together to see if they can win the knife or the scissors. So that was a fun promotion that Simmons did and a great card. Another promotion they did was the Curtis aeroplane. This bill on the left-hand side there is from City Hardware in Greensboro, Alabama, and they were expecting this plane to come to town, and then they would let their customers take a ride. So it was just another way to promote the brand. And this is another fun card. Again, I wish it was in better shape, but it's the only one I've ever seen. So it's a great card. Some other King Cutter cards that these were done by dealers individually. So it wasn't something that Simmons Hardware even had to finance or anything. So now they had dealers who were promoting their logos and their own stores, but a lot of it was their own logos. And this exaggeration card is a really rare example. I've not seen another exaggeration card or this card anywhere else. So it's a one that I was excited to get. On the upper right-hand side there, I find this one interesting because they painted this on the side of their store, and they went through the King Cutter store sells hardware, stoves, groceries, guns, and ammunition, and then Nuff Said. And I've heard this Nuff Said, of course, but I always thought that it was something a little bit more recent. This is a 1908 postcard with Nuff Said on it, so I find that fun and interesting. I thought it was newer than that. And then Poplar Bluff, Missouri is where the elephant's at. Another fun way to really get the name out there. Of these dealers who produced postcards and was really promoting this brand, none were more prolific than Jay Bowman in Flora, Illinois. Uh, Jay Bowman did just a bunch of different postcards. I love them. I've been collecting them the entire time that I've been collecting King Cutter postcards. And there just is a variety of different ones that he did, and they're so well put together. I'm not sure who the photographer is. I'm hoping somebody here might be able to help me. I believe it's TW, and it would have been in the Flora, Illinois area. I'm sure somebody knows who that is. But I just think they're just such a unique card. This middle card with the sewing machine, that one I bought on a mail auction many years ago. I think it was about 1991 is when I bought that. And I came to the Wichita Postcard show knowing that I had won that card at auction, and I was pretty excited about it. And so, yeah, it was one of the best cards I had purchased to date. And and really was a big boost. And I continued looking after that. So here's some more Jay Bowman. He was not only a promoter with postcards, he was a promoter in his community. And he would put up banners and signs and sponsor different things. There's a trapeze artist in the upper right hand corner there. That's kind of fun that he had a trapeze artist come to town and put his signage around it so you couldn't watch the trapeze without actually seeing the King Cutter logos. Parades. Peerless Fence Day is the lower left-hand corner there, so they're trying to sell fence in advance, and had Peerless Fence Day, and the community showed up. I'm sure he was probably having refreshments, and it was just a fun thing for the community. Upper right-hand corner is yet another different promotion on a different day, but also something that I find over and over again in Jay Bowman cards. This one's a fun one that he did. Obviously, it was during election season. I'm not sure if it was a political rally or what was exactly was going on here. There were some ladies on the stage, but the Taft Sherman banner is something that I know I'd like to have, and I have a feeling that that's something that would interest Hal as well. But it's an interesting photo and a way that he really did a good job of promoting the brand. This card I bought from Jim Denny many years ago. I believe that each of the photos on this card are a postcard, are also a postcard. I have a couple of them, but the one card that I'd really like to have of all of the King Cutter cards is the center card. So if anybody has that card, I'd be very interested in acquiring that. Of course, we all have one that we're looking for. That's the one that would be kind of the holy grail of my collection. The Winchester store. So this is an interesting piece of the history of Simmons Hardware Company. Now we're coming off of World War One. Winchester Company had been geared up to make war goods. Were selling a lot of goods to the U.S. government for the war effort, and they were even building facilities. They built facilities to manufacture goods for the war effort. They went into debt to do that, and a lot of the debt was held by the company of Kidder Peabody, which until recently was I mean they were in business up until 9/11. I think shortly after 9/11 is when they were dissolved. But Kidder Peabody was an investment banking company, and they held a lot of debt on Winchester at the end of World War One. So they were seeking a way to utilize their manufacturing facilities and the foundries and things that they had went into debt to purchase during the war. And what they came up with was that they should be making tools and cutlery. It fit perfectly with the equipment that they had and the foundries, and so they went into the tool business in about 1918. They started producing some tools, and they were high quality, really good quality tools, heavy, a lot of steel, and just really well done, high quality tools. They found that they were unable to distribute the tools, so they ended up with warehouses full of tools with no ability to distribute them. So distribution was their issue. They took more financing from Kidder Peabody and a couple of other companies, and they purchased the largest hardware distributor in the world, and that was Simmons Hardware Company. So that happened in 1922. They announced that on June 26, 1922, both companies announced that they had merged, and the idea was that Winchester would manufacture goods and Simmons Hardware Company would distribute them through their stores. Now we see that the list on this letterhead on the left there, we see that the list of regional warehouses in 1922 is St. Louis, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Toledo, Minneapolis, Sioux City, and Wichita. So they were kind of spread out across the country to try to get goods to the stores as quickly as possible. So this merger took place in 1922, and the result of that merger was the Winchester Simmons Company. This did not go over well. They were already in competition. So now dealers in the same town who had previously been buying Winchester goods are being called on by the Simmons salesman, who was their competitor. And the Simmons stores in towns was upset because the salesman who had been calling on them suddenly are calling on their competitor too and selling them their Winchester goods. So it wasn't going over super well. Winchester came up with a plan, though part of their plan was a development of something called the Winchester Store. Up until this time, Simmons Hardware Company, Shapley Hardware Company, a couple of others had house brands that they were using on branded goods, and they would, if you were a store in a small town and wanted to sell Simmons King Cutter, you could have a sign for outside your store, but you didn't have to. It'd still be Smith Hardware Store, and you happen to have a King Cutter sign out there that says that you sell those goods. Winchester's idea was to have a full identity store in the town. And so, as a dealer in a small town, you would not put your name on the front of the hardware store. You'd put the Winchester store on your store. It would be painted a uniform color, which is gray with red stenciling, and everything would be marked the Winchester store. You would not merchandise your store with your name. It would be the Winchester store. And that's what they did. And this was the first time that had happened. It was very much a new thing. Um, it was an idea that Winchester wanted to provide all of the goods for the store, the biggest amount that they possibly could, 80 or 90% of the goods in each hardware store they wanted to have come from their warehouse. And it was a idea that was put forward first by Louis Liggett. Louis Liggett started the Rexall brand, and Rexall was very much set up in this way that everything in the store was branded Rexall. And so they hired Louis Liggett, and Louis came on as an advisor to this process with Winchester to try to do the same thing and have the same success that he had had with the Rexall name with the Winchester name. And so this store is in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, and this is another shot of the same store, and you'll see at the top of the store, there's no mention of the store owner. It's only the Winchester store. So that was an interesting thing that happened. Problem is it was not a successful plan. With the Great Depression looming, by 1930, this plan was a failure. It was deemed a failure. Winchester was almost broke. Their loans were being called, and they went into receivership. The Winchester Simmons Company went into receivership, and the receiver was Kidder Peabody because they held the most debt. And the trustee divided the two companies. So they took Winchester and brought them back out, and they could only produce guns and ammunition. They couldn't produce any other hardware or anything else. They were out of that business starting in 1930. They put Simmons Hardware Company back into business just as a hardware company. Winchester bought themselves out of receivership within about 3 years. Simmons Hardware Company never did buy themselves out of receivership. And in 1940, Simmons Hardware Company sold to their great competitor, Shapley Hardware Company. So after all of these years and after all of the competition, and they were arch enemies, and 1940, Shapley Hardware Company swoops in, buys the King Cutter brand name, Simmons Hardware Company, but really what they were after was the King Cutter brand name and the name recognition and goodwill that had been built up on that brand for over so many years. So on 18 years almost to the day, on June 28th, 1940, it was announced, Simmons Hardware Company announced that Shapley had purchased controlling interest in Simmons Hardware and Paint Corporation. And Shapley also announced that. Again, there was a lot of disappointment with King Cutter dealers. There was a lot of disappointment with Diamond Edge and Norvell Shapley, Shapley Hardware dealers. There was just disappointment among both of them, but They started that in 1940 and they continued clear into the up until 1960, 1959. They went out of business. By 1962, the King Cutter and Diamond Edge logo was purchased by a company called Valtest Corporation out of Chicago. They still hold those two logos. They are a hardware purchasing company for wholesale hardware houses. The owner of that is Russell Meeks, and he has full control of those two logos, and he's a friend of mine. We talk periodically. So that's the great circle of the dueling hardware companies. They dueled for a long time and ended up in the same camp. So it's an interesting story. I have a few more photos that are um, related to these companies that I've collected over the years. This is by no means all of the photos that I have. I have a lot of photos and photo postcards. I'm getting ready to put a book out. I'm hoping that I can have a book done within the year that has a lot of this history and more detail and a lot more photos in it. So look forward to that. And I'll make sure that maybe at next year's postcard show, we'll have some of them out if you're interested. So here are a few more postcards that I have. These are Norlay diamonds. So Norlay was a brand that was developed by Norvell, and it's a combination of Norvell and Shapley. Norlay diamond. They put it on lanterns and they put it on wagons and a few other things. And so here's a couple of Norlay diamond wagons. And here's a couple of Simmons wagons. We got a Simmons Roadster. Simmons had some other house brands that they used, often using the same KK as in King Cutter. And this is a King Coaster with K's wagon on the right hand side there. And that was a brand that they used. They used Clipper Club on ice skates. They had other brands that they used where they used 2Ks. Here's King Coasters, a couple more of them. The dogs, great shots, great postcards. I seek them out. As I said, Shapley did a lot more printed cards than Simmons did. And so here's some very attractive printed cards that Shapley did. There are a few different series of cards, and I've got some of each series, I think. But I'm always kind of looking to see if I can find additions to the series collections that I have. So the Bingler bats and tires, alarm clocks. I have a small collection of Shapley alarm clocks, and they're kind of fun. Here's some other Simmons and King Cutter cards. Not sure who the guy in the middle is, but he's adorned with King Cutter logos, of course. Really fun. Even getting the ladies involved with their hand fan. A good interior with some of the point of sale that was available to the dealers. They had showcases and fixtures and all different kinds of things that they could buy with the King Cutter logo and without. So they had everything that was necessary to develop a new hardware store. This card is unusual because of all of the King Cutter logos. There's hundreds, almost 100 logos, it seems like, on there. But in addition to that, is they are also promoting Our Very Best. Our Very Best is a brand, a house brand of Hibbard, Spencer, and Bartlett in Chicago. So I find it interesting that they're promoting King Cutter as wildly as they are on this and Our Very Best at the same time. That's Morrill, Kansas. These two cards are exterior shots of the Kling Hardware, William Kling Hardware, and I find they were my first two exterior shots. I bought them like in 1990 or something, and they got me excited about King Cutter postcards and the prospect of finding more. So these two cards have been with me a long time. This card's fun because of all once again, the prolific use of the logo all over this little shack that is his hardware store. The card on the left here is from Minneapolis, Hennepin Avenue. I have not been down there yet. I live 30 miles away from Hennepin Avenue, so I want to try to make it over there at some point and see if I can find this building. This was more than likely because of the wholesale house, Simmons Wholesale Hardware Company house in Minneapolis. I'm sure they put this sign up. And then the other is West Point, Iowa, with the airplane and you see the logo on the side of the building. That's it. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I enjoyed giving it. It's a story that I like to tell. I think it's a really fun, different little snapshot of history that is always it's always fun to show new people. So again, I hope you enjoyed it. There you have it. Any questions?
Who's got the King Cutter logo now?
Okay, so in 1960, Shapley Hardware Company went out of business. In 1962, a company called Valtest. And Valtest is interesting. I know Russell Meeks is the owner of Valtest. He lives in Chicago. His grandparent or his grandpa started the company, and what they do is they provide hardware for wholesale hardware companies, but they don't have a stock of their own. They basically contract with like plumb hammers for a certain pricing based on the volume that they can produce, and then they have things drop shipped at the dealer, so they don't even have a warehouse. He's operating out of it. But the story there, real briefly, the story there is that after Shapley went out of business, the logos were owned by one of the vice presidents of the company. He was going to do something with them, make money with them somehow. Well, he wanted to go through a divorce, so he took them to the Cayman Islands and put them into a trust in the Cayman Islands. And he died. And he was the only one on the trust. And so it took like 5 years or something like that for the Meeks guys to get that bought out, to figure out all the ins and outs of it, to buy those logos. And then they used them, Valtest used them. Valtest got their name actually from Hibbard, Spencer, and Bartlett started True Value Hardware. They had True Value, True Test, and Valtest was 3 of their brands. Well, they owed Mr. Meeks a favor, and he asked them if he could have the Valtest name. And so they gave him the Valtest name. Cotter was the guy who did it, president of Cotter and Company that owns True Value. And they give him the Valtest name, and that's why Valtest is Valtest. Anyway, so they did produce some things in the 70s and used it as promotion and things. And currently Russell has it licensed out to a knife maker, but he refuses to let them manufacture outside of the U.S. So at one time it was a Frost Cutlery, and Frost Cutlery went from U.S. manufacturing to foreign manufacturing, and he cut the contract, and they no longer do the manufacturing of the pocket knives.
Any other questions?
Yes.
I was just going to say, my grandfather had a hardware store in Kansas City from 1901 to about 1925. And of course, I don't remember, because I was born in Caribbean, but my mother used to talk about going down to his hardware store, and he had a lot of the King Cutter products.
Oh, really?
And he sold the store right before the crash in 29, but when they had the estate sale in 71 of his property, there were some King Cutter items that went on sale. He had like a lot of the razors, and he had a lot of garden tools. He had a pretty large hardware store.
Yeah. So that was it's interesting, the trade route that developed between St. Louis down the Missouri River. They couldn't use the same barges as they did on the Mississippi River, so it would come from New Orleans to St. Louis, and it had to change barges. And that's one of the reasons why St. Louis became the hub that it did, is because of this whole idea that they couldn't take the same barges in the Missouri River as they had in the, and that's how they got to Kansas City, is they would take stuff over to Kansas City and by barge on smaller barges.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the trade route you're describing underlines one of the great economic strengths of the United States. Speaking as a Canadian, you've got the Atlantic coast, you've got the Pacific coast, and in the middle of the country, you've got this enormous trade route, you know, through the Mississippi River and its tributaries, and that's really a big strength of the United States economically.
Well, and it goes, you know, if you really dig into it, it goes far beyond, or far back, way farther than you know, history, actually, a written history, because that was the Mississippian culture, you know, developed around the Mississippi River and up and down the river there. They used it for moving goods, and you'll find things from way far south, way up north, and things like that, and it was used as a route, yeah, as long as there's been history, I think.
Cole?
Yeah.
I've got there was a New Dorf hardware store in my hometown of St. Joseph, Missouri. I've got a three-dimensional trade sign, Axe Head, and it, you know, so it's, Axe Head owns this hall, but the New Dorf name on it is in a shield that looks identical to your early.
Oh, really?
Postal, which makes me wonder if it wasn't a King Cutter trade sign, and they painted their name over it.
Maybe, because I have seen that trade sign. It's a rare trade sign. In fact, I know of at least one depiction of that trade sign. I'll try to get a picture of it and get it to you.
I'll send you a picture of mine.
Yeah, I'd love to see that, yeah. We'll exchange, yeah. But yeah, there's a drawing that I have that has essentially that sign that you're describing in it. And then one came up for sale a few years ago with King Cutter logo on it. It sold, I don't know, $12,000 or something. It was an expensive sign. Yeah.
So, yes, you collect postcards, but what kind of other King Cutter items do you collect? Like, what would your favorite be, or the most expensive one that you have?
Yeah, so I've kind of gone to advertising things mostly. I've had tools. I mean, they made everything. They made a lot of things. It was their highest quality goods. So they would have King Cutter scissors that were more expensive, but then they'd have Simmons special scissors that weren't as expensive than other brands and things like that. They had numerous brand names. So for me, signs are fun and valuable. There's a group of signs, they're called fence signs, and they were put out kind of during the 30s, so it was during the receivership years, and it has the store names on them. And when it used to be, when one was found, there'd be 15 of them found with the same store name on them. So they stayed at about $125 for a long time. You could buy them for $125, and people collected the different states and whatever. And so now they've all been kind of distributed out, and so now when they come up, it's one. And if you want that one, then the price has gone up on them quite a bit, just like all advertising signs. But yeah, I like signs, and there's just so many cool things, you know. Some of the horse tack and things with the logos on them that they use for parades, some of that still exists and brings big money.
Any other comments or anything? Our friend John Jones, who's is here as the dealer. John is the son of our founder of our Wichita Postcard Club. His dad was Bert P. Jones, and his wife was Bessie Jones. They were the first family of the club for many, many years, and he's here, and he found this advertising for King Cutter and brought it to me, and we want you to have it.
Oh, well,
Add it to your collection.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So this was the kind of these were sort of the basis of the spaced repetition of brand recognition that they used. They were in Saturday Evening Post. They were in all of the major publications. In fact, Grant's mom used to have a whole section just of King Cutter Saturday Evening Post ads in the store. I bought several of them from them years ago, but yeah, they were. They tried. This in here is from Successful Farming, and so any place they thought, including Ladies Home Journal, they'd advertise in Ladies Home Journal and other magazines and things that were related to kids, boys' life, and different things like that. So the brand was really out there. Not that many people would recognize it. If you took this to your friend group, very few people would recognize that brand, but at the time it was Coca-Cola, like just as recognizable.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so
Yep,
much. I should have mentioned it earlier, but he's been a longtime member, as he's let it be known. And many of you remember him from before, but we're so glad to have you back this year and for you to have done this for us.